qui lance l'enregistrement. Okay, so let's start. I'm glad to present you Kelly Coboum, who is economist at the Global Change Center located within Virginia Tech. As you can guess, Kelly is, of course, an economist specialized in environmental and resource economics, but with a special focus on the interplay between natural systems and human decisions. And with this respect, she has published numerous articles dealing with environmental problems in water management, in forest management, and also in land allocation problems. Today, she will present a paper entitled Forest Dynamics and Ecosystem Collapse, delaying tipping points in the face of decision-making myopia. I just forgot to say that she's currently visiting researcher at the Bureau d'économie théorique et appliquée. And she was also during year 2021 visiting researcher at Paris Dauphine University, and also at the climate economic chair. And it's as a colleague from the climate economic chair that I'm glad to present. So Kelly, you will have 45 minutes to present your paper. We will proceed by about 50 minutes of discussion with the participants. And I have a special request for the participants. If you have questions to ask Kelly during the presentation, please write them in the chat, and I will regularly check the chat and eventually stop Kelly to ask the question. Okay, so Kelly, the floor, or at least the Zoom, is yours for 45 minutes.
Okay, great, thank you. I'll go ahead and share my screen. Okay, so I'll be talking today about forest dynamics and ecosystem collapse. This is a project that I started when I arrived in France about a year ago, working with Philippe Delacote at Beta and a colleague Greg Amaker at Virginia Tech, as well as Haiyu Wang, who is a PhD student at Virginia Tech. In this project, we're looking generally at merging two veins of the economic literature, one related to forest transition theory and the second related to ecological collapse. And in merging those, we'll take into account differences between primary and secondary forests and talk about why those are important from the standpoint of driving a system past an ecological threshold. So I'll start with an introduction of these three areas of study. So there are important differences between primary and secondary forests, both in terms of their ability to support the production of marketed food and fiber products, as well as to support non-market ecosystem goods and services. So you can see in this image a difference between primary forest on the left and a secondary forest on the right. This is in the Brazilian Amazon. So the primary forest on the left consists of natural old growth, whereas on the right-hand side, we have a plantation of cassava. So secondary forests can take the form of either natural regeneration or this type of plantation investment. So in general, what we see in these primary forest stands is mixed species and mixed ages. And that's important from the standpoint of biodiversity and also of providing different ecosystem goods and services. In contrast, in secondary forest stands, they tend to be single species, even-aged stands with relatively short harvest rotations. So in the Brazilian Amazon, these are species that generally are on like a 5-year harvest rotation. Of course, primary forests are important for the production of non-timber forest products, as well as selective timber harvesting. But secondary forests really present an advantage in terms of intensive food and fiber production. In contrast, primary forests outperform secondary forests in terms of ecosystem service production. Numerous studies have shown that primary forests are, of course, home to greater biodiversity, but that they also tend to lower the ground temperature and reduce fire risk. Okay. In contrast, secondary forest stands tend to support relatively low levels of biodiversity, and we can also see greater fire risk in these secondary forest stands. Okay. A final difference between primary and secondary forest that I'll return to in just a few moments is that there are often in many developing countries land tenure costs associated with secondary forest plantation investments. And that is because of the way that property rights are typically awarded. They often are awarded for deforesting primary forest and converting it into agricultural production. It's relatively easy to protect in agricultural land investment. It becomes much more difficult, and the property rights are not well defined for protecting secondary forest plantations from encroachment and infringement. So that's something that we'll take into account in this model as well. So I want to talk about forest transition theory, which is really where we started with this paper. So the transition model was presented originally by Mather in 1992. And so what Mather noticed empirically is that many countries that have already developed and many countries that are going through the development process have followed at a national aggregate level a similar path in terms of net forest land area. Okay. So in many cases, what we tend to see for a nation is that there is a period of deforestation early in the process of economic growth. At some point, we hit a minimum level in terms of forested land area, which Mather coined as the turning point. Okay, so I'll be referring to the turning point throughout this presentation. And what I'm talking about is this point where we have the minimum forested land area in a country. After the turning point, we tend to see greater efforts toward reforestation that tend to drive an increase in forested land area. So numerous studies in the economic literature have built on this idea of the forest transition, but primarily focusing on this first portion of the curve prior to the turning point. So these models tend to take a competing land use approach, looking at relative rents in land in primary forest versus in agriculture, and using that to look at the process of deforestation. More recently, there's been an economic literature that's emerged to look at the forest transition, but also to take into account the potential for a transition in forest composition. Okay, so over the course of that curve, we have a change in aggregate land area, forested land area, but we also have a change in the type of forest that we see on the ground. Okay. So during this deforestation phase, obviously we're drawing down primary forest, and then starting to rebuild the net forested land area after the turning point, but predominantly with secondary forests, either naturally regenerated or planted. Okay. What's important to notice here is that this literature has focused a lot on reaching this turning point as sort of a harbinger of an improvement in the system's ability to support ecosystem services. But we can still have a decline, we can still have deforestation and a loss of primary forest, even when we are gaining in terms of net forested land area. And if secondary forests do not provide a perfect substitute for primary forests in terms of ecosystem service production, what we can see is that even as we pass this turning point and begin to rebuild forested land area, we can still be losing ecosystem services. And that opens up the opportunity for us to pass an ecological tipping point or go over an ecological threshold, which would result in a system change. So that's primarily what we're interested in considering here. Ideas of ecological collapse are not new. Of course, they originated in the ecological literature. There's this really famous ball and cup diagram that articulates sort of how we can see a system regime shift or a system passing a tipping point. So for example, in the Brazilian Amazon, we are starting here in regime 1, which is a tropical rainforest. Okay. We can have a loss of resilience and a weakening of feedbacks like climate feedbacks or fire feedbacks in the system, okay, and external shocks, both of which can drive the system across a critical threshold and into a different regime, which is characterized by its own type of resilience and its own feedbacks, okay? But that regime could be very different in terms of its ability to provide both marketed ecosystem services and goods and non-market ecosystem services and goods. So there has been a large literature in economics that has looked at ecological collapse. I think the earliest studies arguably were those that looked at open access in marine fisheries. And the type of collapse considered there was extinction, specifically of a species. There have been a number of studies that have looked at more general natural resource systems and different types of problems like invasive species spread, certainly lake eutrophication, so a decline or a shift from an oligotrophic system, which is a relatively clear lake, into one that's eutrophic, which I actually showed a picture of on the previous slide, which tends to have algal blooms. So you're losing fish habitat as well as recreational opportunities. More recently, there's also been a literature that has looked at tipping points specifically in the context of climate. Okay, so this is kind of what we had in the back of our minds when we started this study, is this shift in terms of the system's ability to support climate regulation services. So part of our motivation is this observation that ecological collapse is currently occurring in the Brazilian Amazon. So specifically what's been noticed is that there are areas of the Amazon that are shifting from a tropical rainforest into a scrub-dominated savanna system. Okay, so basically there are areas that are shifting from Amazon rainforest into a system that's more similar to the Brazilian Cerrado. That shift into grasslands means that the land really is no longer productive in what have typically been the dominant land uses, right? So it's not land that can be planted to a forested system, nor is it land that can then be used in agriculture or livestock grazing. So we're certainly losing the ability to support the production of marketed goods and services, but also losing the ability of the system to regulate climate and other natural processes. So there have been a couple mechanisms proposed by scientists to explain this shift from rainforest into savanna. The first of which has to do with local fire feedbacks. And so the idea here is that fires are amplifying drought and forest loss and leading to more intense fires, which are driving the system across a threshold. The second mechanism that's been proposed has to do with moisture dynamics. So what we see with deforestation is reduced evapotranspiration, which alters precipitation patterns. And has actually driven a change in the circulation of the South American monsoon. And so there's a directional gradient in that too. But the bottom line is that there are a couple of different mechanisms that are driving this ecosystem regime shift. And there are certainly losses associated with the transition from rainforest into savanna. So the last point that I'll make before jumping into the model is that we see that even when there is greater understanding that these types of ecological thresholds or tipping points exist, that there continues to be relatively myopic decision-making undertaken in many tropical developing countries, including Brazil. So historically, there are examples of myopic decision-making, even when resource degradation is known and observed, associated with boom and bust timber extraction policies in Southeast Asia. And so the idea there was that there was a boom in export markets for timber that drove a weakening of institutions protecting the environment. And so there was this, in order to support an increase in rent generation. And this cycle sort of continued all the while degrading the forest stock and leading to important ecological changes. More recently, some examples of myopic decision-making have arisen as Indonesia, for example, has already begun backtracking on a commitment made at the COP26 to stop deforestation within, I think that it was 20 or 30 years. So they already walked back that commitment, talking about a need to prioritize rent generation. Similarly, Brazil, over the past decade under Bolsonaro's government, has reversed many of the gains that were made in reducing deforestation since the early 2000s. And that is largely because the government is at this point prioritizing resource extraction over protection. So the point and an important premise for our analysis is that even with knowledge of ecological collapse, the potential for it to be there, governments may continue to prioritize doing nothing or catering to extractive or agricultural industries. So building on these core ideas, what we're doing here is we're integrating the literature on forest transition theory with the literature on ecological collapse. And what we want to take into account in particular in doing so is the potential for dynamic changes in forest composition, and also the potential for secondary forest tenure costs, land tenure costs to play a role. So these are the costs associated with protecting a secondary forest investment. In building a model that links these two areas of the literature, the questions that we'd like to answer are, when do we think collapse of a system might occur? Okay. What are the factors that influence the timing of collapse, and which policies might be most effective in delaying the arrival of a tipping point? So a shift from rainforest into savanna. And then we'd also like to examine under what conditions the turning point is really a relevant concept. So the forest transition literature has been quite focused on the turning point, but it might be that if we reach a tipping point before the turning point, that it's not really that useful a concept moving forward. To address these questions, we first develop a theoretical model. And this model innovates on the current literature by incorporating the possibility for substitutability between primary and secondary forests. So much of the current literature essentially treats primary and secondary forests as perfect substitutes in the production of ecosystem services. We know that they're not perfect substitutes. So we want to incorporate in a more general fashion the potential for them to be imperfectly substitutable. And then we'll incorporate that into a dynamic forest transition model, into which we'll also incorporate an irreversible and deterministic collapse point. It's a deterministic, it's a known threshold at this point. We would like to incorporate uncertainty in that threshold in a future analysis, but have started with the relatively more tractable case of a known threshold. The first component of the theoretical model is this ecosystem services production function. So we're just designating generally some ecosystem service or a vector of ecosystem services. This could be climate regulation services, biodiversity, however you want to think about it. We're being agnostic a little bit with that definition, okay? But we have ecosystem services that are generated by primary forested land area and land area in secondary forest. Okay. But we recognize that primary and secondary forest are not perfect substitutes for one another in ecosystem service production. So the way that we accommodate that in the theoretical model is with a generalized constant elasticity of substitution production function of the standard form shown here, okay, where alpha is a scale parameter that's greater than 0. Beta F and beta S are share parameters for primary forest, which is denoted by capital F, and secondary forest by capital S. And then we have this substitution parameter rho, which depends on the elasticity of substitution between primary and secondary forests. And so one of the things that's nice about this CES production function is that it nests a couple of specific cases, including Cobb-Douglas and perfect substitutes. So as I mentioned previously, perfect substitutes is what the literature has been using to date for forest transitions. So we'll look more generally at relaxing that restriction in this analysis. So we incorporate that production function into a forest transition problem. This problem has already been established in the forest transitions literature. So this is a pretty solid basis to look at dynamic changes between three primary land uses. We have primary old growth forest, secondary forest, which may be either naturally regenerated or planted, and agriculture as our competing land uses. We have an initial land area in primary forest, which is given by capital F at time 0. An initial land area in secondary forest given by capital S in time 0. And then our land area in agriculture is the residual, capital L minus land in primary and secondary forest. So those are our state variables, primary and secondary forest. We have two control variables. The first is deforestation. Okay, this is a unidirectional change in primary forest. Over the timescales that we're looking at, we're not regrowing primary forest. This is hundreds and hundreds of years old. Our equation of motion for primary forest is given by the negative of deforestation. Okay, so we're reducing primary forested land area. We also have a control variable for reforestation. Again, we're moving one direction with this. We're only increasing land in secondary forests. It's generally secondary forests tend to be planted on land that is not of sufficiently high quality to support robust agricultural production. So it's pretty rare that land would be taken out of secondary forest production once it's planted. In primary forests, when we harvest, we generate one-time harvest revenues that are given by the price of the market price of primary forest products times the amount deforested. We generate also rents in secondary forest systems given by the product of PS, which is our price of secondary forest products, and reforested land area. So we can think of this as the capitalized value of the stream of goods and services produced by a secondary forest stand over its lifetime. And we're defining in this model the time period to be the length of a secondary forest rotation, which is on the order of 5 years. Okay. So all of the other variables, the harvest revenues for primary forest, are summarized similarly over a 5-year time horizon. We have harvesting costs given by a convex cost function in primary forest systems, and conversion costs for secondary forests, as well as a land tenure cost component, all of which are convex. I do see that there's a question, so I'm not sure. Should I stop? Continue.
No, I think that there is no question for the time being.
Okay, great.
At least I do not see question. No, there is no question for the time being.
Okay, thank you. We also have land rents earned in agriculture, okay, which are given by the concave function H. Okay. So these are the basic components of the forest transition problem. So bringing these components together, we can write the objective functional for an open loop dynamic problem in which a decision maker is choosing the paths of deforestation and reforestation to maximize this expression. So we have, as is typical, our continuous discounting term with discount rate given by delta. We have a time horizon between 0 and capital T, which will be endogenous in this model and which I'll talk about in just a moment. Okay. But the components here include an ecosystem service benefit function, which depends on E, ecosystem service production. So this is non-market ecosystem services. Okay, so there is some benefit that can be derived from the production of non-market ecosystem goods and services. Agricultural land rents. We have the profits from deforestation, secondary forest harvest rents, and the costs associated with secondary forest management and tenure. So we're maximizing this expression subject to our 2 equations of motion, which I defined in the previous slide, and our production function, which expresses ecosystem service production as a function of land in primary and secondary forest area. We as well have our initial conditions for primary and secondary forest. So what we haven't specified yet is a transversality condition defining the end of the problem. So this is where we bring in our ecological collapse point. The idea here is that we have a known threshold in ecosystem service production, below which the system can no longer continue to provide the same ecosystem goods and services that it did before. So this would be consistent with a threshold where we would shift from rainforest into savanna. So we define this threshold generally as E min. So for every time period before the end of the problem, capital T, our ecosystem service production is above E min. We hit that threshold E min in capital T, which defines the end of the problem. Okay. We'll choose that time period freely. So basically what we're doing in this problem is we're finding the isoquant associated with E min, which will be realized in the final time period in the problem. So essentially we're not assuming there's any salvage value. We reach a tipping point and it's sort of an end of the world scenario in which the system no longer continues to support ecosystem goods or non-market or market ecosystem good production. So we're looking for that isoquant associated with E min. If we take that isoquant and rearrange it, what we can do is derive a free state transversality condition, okay, which requires that the ratio of the co-state variables or the shadow values for primary and secondary forest equals the marginal rate of technical substitution between primary and secondary forests in the production of ecosystem goods. And then we add to that our free time transversality condition, which is that the Hamiltonian evaluated in the final time period of the model equals 0. And with these transversality conditions, we have a fully specified dynamic problem. With the analytical model, what we can do, which is similar to what's been derived in previous papers looking at the forest transition, are general expressions characterizing the paths of deforestation and reforestation. The paths of deforestation and reforestation are driven by a comparison of the relative rents earned to land in agriculture versus land in primary or secondary forest, respectively. Okay. The main difference between our model and models that have come previously in the literature is that we add this middle term, B prime times the partial of E with respect to capital F, and B prime times the partial of E with respect to capital S. And so what this adds is that whenever B prime is greater than 0, so there is some benefit derived to the relevant decision maker from non-market ecosystem service production, the CES production function parameters will play a role in driving the shape of the paths of deforestation and reforestation. So that's something that we'll explore further in our empirical analysis. Another thing that we can do here, which differs from prior papers, is to derive a result for the path of ecosystem service production, okay, E dot T. And what we can show is that this expression depends on the CES production function parameters. So we can see alpha, the share parameters, and our substitution parameter rho here, as well as the paths of reforestation and deforestation, where A is just that expression from the CES production function. This is a complex nonlinear expression. There's not a lot that we can do, but we can derive at least some sufficient conditions. These are not necessary, but just sufficient conditions for E dot T to be less than 0. So if ecosystem service production is decreasing over a long enough time horizon, we will eventually reach the threshold level E min and cross that threshold. So what we can show is that in the special case where we have perfect substitutes between primary and secondary forest, there are two conditions that are sufficient for a negative or a declining path in ecosystem service production. We need the share of ecosystem service production from primary forests to exceed that of secondary forests, which is certainly the case in the Brazilian Amazon and many other tropical developing countries. And we need for deforestation to be outpacing reforestation. So we really are in this region of the forest transition before the turning point. If we relax the value of rho to be between 0 and 1, We have the same two conditions, but we can add to that that the total land area in primary forests exceeds that in secondary forests. This is not a restrictive assumption, certainly, in the case where we are before the turning point and deforestation is still outpacing reforestation. This is about as far what I want to say. Oh, yes.
There is one question by Lionel.
Okay.
I think it's maybe a problem of definition of your secondary forest. Lionel is asking, isn't it a strong, too much strong assumption that there is no deforestation in secondary forest?
A super strong assumption that there is no deforestation in secondary forests. No, I mean, in many of these systems, we really so we're concerned with the Brazilian Amazon. I might think a little bit more carefully about this in a developed country that's further along the sort of net forest cover trajectory. But in many cases, secondary forest investments are really only just beginning. And they generally are undertaken on land that is marginal for agriculture and has already been deforested from primary forests. And so I don't think that it's a strong assumption that we would not be removing land that's been planted to a secondary forest. Now, we might think about abandoning that land and the opportunity to harvest it. But in that case, the land would still be providing some ecosystem service benefits.
Okay, thank you.
Mm-hmm. The main point that I wanted to make with the sufficient conditions is that it is possible to reach the tipping point. So we could have ecosystem collapse prior to reaching the turning point in net forested land area. So to examine this problem further, we go to an empirical model. So our approach, and I'm going to go through this part pretty quickly so we can talk about the results, is to use a numerical simulation, which we solve by first using the transversality conditions to define the boundary conditions or boundary values at the end of the problem. And then given those boundary values, we'll solve the system of differential equations for the optimal paths of deforestation and reforestation. We parameterize the model with functional forms that are drawn from the related forest transitions literature, and with parameters drawn from a number of recent sources that allow us to calibrate the model in aggregate to general conditions in the Brazilian Amazon. If you're interested in reading more about this, I'm happy to share the working paper. So I'll transition now into talking about the results of the empirical analysis. So I'll first talk about the base case with our initial parameter values, and then about the results from a number of different policy scenarios, which we think represent different approaches that are currently either being considered or undertaken in tropical developing countries. And then finally, we'll talk about the importance of decision maker preferences. In our base case, what we're showing in the upper panel here is the land area in primary forest in the green dotted line. Secondary forest is in the blue dashed line. And then we have agricultural land, and total forest cover is the solid black line. So what we can see is that we're under the initial parameter assumptions, reaching the tipping point in the model in period 30, which is still during the phase in which deforestation is outpacing reforestation. So if we hadn't reached the tipping point, we would have reached the turning point in period 35, which is about 175 years from now. But we see the tipping point occur first in period 30, which is 150 years into the future. One of the other results that we look at is the tipping point when the decision maker is relatively myopic. So when they place a low weight on the provision of non-market ecosystem services. And we see that, as expected, that change tends to advance the tipping point in time. So we see that in period 26, which is 20 years earlier than under the baseline case. The bottom panel on the right-hand side shows the path of ecosystem service production, ET, which is decreasing over time until it hits the minimum threshold level in period 30. So from this base case, we wanted to consider changes in a number of parameter values that reflect, we think, important policies that are being considered or undertaken in these systems. There's been a lot of discussion in policy circles about undertaking practices that might make secondary forests a better substitute for primary forests in terms of ecosystem service production. So some examples of mechanisms to do so include anything that increases the quality of reforestation and harvesting techniques. Approaches that have been proposed include diameter limit harvesting, reduced impact logging requirements, or favoring natural regeneration over forest plantations. We capture this type of possibility by looking at change in the value of the CES substitution parameter rho. We think that within the realm of what's currently being considered, that probably a range of 0.2 to 0.5 is most reasonable for this parameter. It is certainly unlikely that we would get up to a value of 1, which would be perfect substitutes for ecosystem service production. What we can see when we look at a range of values for the CES substitution parameter, the gray is our baseline case, is that pretty large changes have relatively little influence on the timing of either the turning point or the tipping point. Okay, so we're not seeing a lot of movement in terms of delaying the time when we have ecological collapse in the system. Similar holds true even for a relatively myopic decision maker. Of course, as our CES substitution parameter increases and secondary forests provide a better substitute in terms of ecosystem service production, we do see a reduction in social costs. So this is one of the key results, which is that our change in the CES substitution parameter exerts a relatively limited effect on the timing of the tipping point. The second broad type of policy that we consider is related to secondary forest land tenure costs. So we'd like to consider a reduction in tenure costs relative to where they are now, which would be consistent with policy changes such as a shift from a de facto policy rights system to one that's more of a de jure based system. This has been implemented in some areas of the Brazilian Amazon, specifically in the state of Acre, with a noticeable influence on the rate of deforestation. But there still remain many areas of the Amazon where property rights really still are de facto for secondary forest plantations. Also, anything that tends to increase enforcement of encroachment and squatting would tend to reduce tenure costs. So one of the major effects that Bolsonaro's government or administration has had on the rate of deforestation of primary forests in the Brazilian Amazon is by reducing the budget for enforcement activities. And that could certainly apply to secondary forest systems as well. So what we can see is that, so again, our gray is our base case with a secondary forest land tenure parameter of 140. When we reduce that by 50%, what we do is we invert the turning and the tipping point. So now we're hitting the turning point in terms of the minimum forested land area in period 30. And we're delaying the tipping point so that we're not hitting that until period 36. We shift from a difference that was negative under our base case, meaning the tipping point preceded the turning point, to one in which the tipping point is delayed beyond the turning point. A similar result holds true even if the decision maker is relatively myopic. As we decrease land tenure costs, we have an increase in social costs. This is because it encourages secondary forest planting, but they still do not provide a better substitute for primary forests in ecosystem service production. So this is a graphic that illustrates what happens when we reduce our secondary forest tenure costs. What we can see is this black line is total forest land cover. So we're hitting the turning point in terms of minimum area prior to hitting the tipping point. We can see that we've delayed the tipping point as well to period 36. A third type of policy instrument that we consider is the potential to increase harvesting costs from primary forests. So these would be policies that would potentially tax the harvest or the transportation of materials in order to deter people from deforesting, more stringent harvesting standards, and certainly a greater enforcement of protected areas are all instruments that could increase the cost of deforestation. So as we increase from our base level of 300 for the primary forest harvesting cost parameter to 450 and 600, what we see is that we delay the turning point. Okay, so we delay that minimum, that point where we get the turn where reforestation begins to outpace deforestation. But we also delay the tipping point, and we delay the tipping point by proportionally more than we delay the turning point. So we can see that increasing by 50% delays the tipping point by 15 periods, and then increasing by 100% delays us to period 67, which is over 200 years into the future. Okay. So our largest difference between the turning and tipping point and our largest delay in the tipping point is achieved with an increase in primary forest harvesting cost. And that result holds true even when the local decision maker is relatively myopic. So this graphic, again, just illustrates the extent of the difference between the turning point and the tipping point. Okay. And that may be beneficial if we're able to, in some way, increase resilience once we pass the turning point. The final sensitivity analysis that we look at is with respect to decision maker preferences. So as we increase the ecosystem service benefit parameter B, we're increasing the weight that the decision maker places on the production of non-market ecosystem services relative to rent generation. Okay. So policies that encourage local or national decision makers to do so include mechanisms like REDD+ and payments for ecosystem services. As you might expect, as we increase the weight placed on ecosystem service benefits, we see a delay in the tipping point and an advance in the turning point. Okay, it exerts an influence on the difference between the two, as well as delays the tipping point. So what are the implications that we can draw from the analytical and empirical models? So the first has to do with the importance of turning versus collapse points. So by and large to date, the forest transition literature has been concerned with the timing of the turning point, but has not incorporated the potential for ecological collapse. And what we show that we think is important is that the turning point really is an irrelevant concept if we're likely to hit an ecological collapse point first. Okay. So reaching the turning point, which has been kind of treated as a goal in this context, is no guarantee that we are going to be able to prevent ecosystem collapse. And we also demonstrate that the timing of the turning point relative to collapse depends on, importantly, on secondary forest tenure costs as well as primary forest harvesting costs. From the analysis, we believe that our results point to the importance of a couple different types of policies for trying to forestall or prevent or delay ecosystem collapse. In particular, we find that forest type, which we thought might be quite important at the outset of our analysis, really seems to exert a minimal influence on the timing of ecosystem collapse. And so this sort of broader discussion about plantations versus natural regeneration, for example, might be less important in the context of delaying these sorts of catastrophic threshold changes. Rather, we find evidence that points to the importance of targeting tenure cost or the security of property rights for secondary forest plantations, as well as a need to continue to focus on increasing the costs associated with deforestation. So by maintaining land in protected status, and by, for example, limiting road construction. So one of the major policies that resulted in a boom in deforestation in the Brazilian Amazon was the construction of the Trans-Amazon Highway. So certainly there are mechanisms or policies that could be pursued to work in the opposite direction, to increase the cost of transporting goods out of primary forest stands. We also think that it's important to, in this context, in particular, to consider government behavior, so the type of policymaker. What we demonstrate is that even with perfect knowledge that the system could be approaching a tipping point, a do-nothing or myopic decision maker may still optimally choose to drive the system there due to a preference for rent generation. From a global perspective, obviously that is not considered to be ideal, as we see in approaches like that proposed through Rent Plus. So something to think about, and which becomes a more important conversation in this context, is the importance of global versus local or national ecological rents. And then finally, I'll just note that although we've considered a deterministic collapse point here, we are moving forward with an analysis to incorporate uncertainty in the collapse point. With that, I thank you for your attention, and I'm happy to answer questions, but also happy to respond by email to any questions that you have that might arise afterward.
Okay, thank you, Kelly. I will first ask whether there are questions from participants, and then I will have some questions also. So, do participants have questions? Well, okay, let me start with my own question. Actually, it's rather a point of vocabulary without detrimental consequences for the whole consistency of your model. But it's relative to what you call tipping point. Actually, as far as I understand your model, your tipping point is actually a kind of lower absorbing bound for ecological services. Mm-hmm. But there is a kind of smooth transition between before reaching the tipping point and once you have reached the tipping point. Mm-hmm. My own understanding of a tipping point was a little bit different, and maybe I can highlight it with one of your first slides, where you draw a graph trying to exhibit two different equilibria in a dynamic model. I do not remember if it's slide 3 or 4. Can you go back to this first slide, please?
Yes, hold on just a second.
Okay. So it was at the first beginning of your presentation.
Is it that?
I do not see change on your slide. Sorry. You're correct. No, we no longer.
I know. I'm trying to fix it. Sorry. Can you see it now?
Yeah. That's it. That's it. Okay. So if you look at this graph on the left of the slide, you have two regimes, and you have two kind of things. One in regime 1 on the left, and one for regime 2 on the right. Mm-hmm. And we see that, for instance, the equilibrium in regime 1, which correspond to the dark point, may change if you modify some control variables, which may be in your model deforestation or the increase in secondary forest. Okay. Mm-hmm. And as long as this control variable do not move too much, then you stay at this first equilibrium in your dynamics. Mm-hmm. Okay. But probably if you change too much, one or two of these control variable, then you suddenly switch to another equilibrium, which mm-hmm. correspond to the bottom of the second seek on regime 2. Mm-hmm. And so there is a kind of critical threshold but the tipping point makes you switch from one equilibrium with a disruption to a second kind of equilibrium. So there is a kind of discontinuity in terms of model equilibrium.
Okay.
Whereas if in your own model, you do not exhibit such a discontinuity in the dynamics of forests. So my question was, is there some models that try to take account of this kind of disruption in the case of deforestation or not?
Yes, there are. Yes, I mean, we're basically treating this tipping point as similarly to what the ecological literature would define as an alley effect. So we're able to drive the system sort of slowly to a level beyond which it can no longer recover. So it's, we're defining the threshold as, okay, it's at this point and it's teetering over into the system that no longer can support the same types of ecosystem goods and services. It's an end of the world scenario. But yes, there are studies that look at the potential to that look at in a different way the potential to drive this system into a different basin of attraction. I don't remember right off the top of my head which ones they are, but I do have those in the paper. There's some discussion of it, so I'd be happy to share that with you. But yes, it's a point well taken. So we do have a somewhat simplistic definition of a threshold in the sense that we are, we're just marching towards this boundary value beyond which we have really no salvage value from the system. And there could certainly be a way of incorporating the potential for the system in the future to provide a different type of ecosystem services, or of modeling that discontinuity in a more continuous fashion. So yeah, it's a point well taken.
And would it be possible, for instance, in your model, to have own dynamics for a primary forest, which means that if you stop, for instance, deforestation, you have a natural regeneration capacity of this primary forest, so that you, if you stop any economic activity, for instance, you go back to the previous natural equilibrium. But if you reach some sufficiently high level of deforestation, then you are no longer able to go back to this situation. Could it be possible to extend your model with this kind of on dynamics of primary forest? And would it be still computationally tractable, of course?
That's a good question. I mean, certainly we're not going to be able to return once we pass that minimum or that threshold level in terms of ecosystem service provision. Prior to that, I would have to think about how we would allow the system to rebuild resilience. That would probably be most likely through reforestation activities sort of a little later into the forest transition curve. Yeah, it's possible. I do think it would be difficult, but definitely possible. One of the things that we also looked at along the way, as you mentioned, there's some smooth change prior to and after reaching the threshold. And we did look at the potential for the provision of agricultural goods and services, as well as secondary forests, to decline as we approach the threshold. And it doesn't really substantially change the qualitative outputs of the model, but does make it a little bit more difficult analytically to present. And so we decided to abstract away from that complexity.
Okay, there is a question by Simon Jean.
Hi.
Please.
Yeah. Thank you for that presentation. It was really interesting. I was wondering to what extent, I mean, let me rephrase that. I was wondering how the way you model this decision makers to be myopic would translate into an uncertain context, right? Because I feel like it's mostly a value that you give to a parameter, sort of. And I was wondering to what extent, if you, for example, have an endogenous tipping point with a continuation value, mechanisms such as the ones depicted in the works of Lemoine and Traeger, could really enter, and you may have something that's more what the literature has been calling myopic, right? Than just changing the value of this parameter. And I wonder, like, what's your take on this? Is there a better way to model decision making being myopic than just changing this parameter?
Mm. Yeah, I mean, I'd have to think about the uncertainty case. Yeah, I don't know. That's a good question. I don't have an answer for you right off the top of my head. I'd have to think about that a little bit more in detail.
All right. Thank you.
Mhm.
Okay, then I have a next question by Lionel Rago.
Yes, thanks, Mark. I have a question about your production function for the ecosystem services. I don't really understand the notion of complementarity between the two types of forest. For example, what kind of ecosystem service cannot come from a primary forest if there is not simultaneously a secondary forest? You see what I mean?
Right. Well, we're not considering anything really in the range of complementarity. We're really looking at the potential for imperfect substitutability, right?
Okay.
So I guess, like, I think the case of complementarity doesn't make a lot of intuitive sense. But we're mostly concerned with relaxing this assumption in the literature that we have perfect substitutes.
Okay.
Because they simply can't support the same ecosystem services.
Okay.
Yeah, but I go back to the question by Ronel. Don't you have then constraint on the elasticity of substitution to reflect the idea that you could there is only imperfect substitutability, because typically with some value of the elasticity of substitution, you may have a given level of eco services with either zero surface of primary forest or zero surface of secondary forest. So you can get rid of one of the two types of forest and still have the same amount of ecological service.
Well, the maximum ecosystem service you could get would be from having all of the original primary forest in place, I guess, but and potentially with additional secondary forest. So if we thought we were already initially starting on some low portion of the curve and building from there, then there would be a potential to increase ecosystem service provision, but only if deforestation stops, right?
Yeah, but I mean, along your isoquant, when you explain that you try to find the isoquant, when you use a constant elasticity of substitution, I think that you have a kind of, it's not a limit case, but it's a kind of tipping value of the elasticity of substitution corresponding to the Cobb-Douglas function.
Right.
If you have less substitutability than at the Cobb-Douglas function, then you absolutely need at least one small piece of both types of forest to obtain your service level. Whereas if you have lower substitutability than for the Cobb-Douglas function, then you can get rid of one of the two types and still obtain the targeted amount of ecological service.
Right. I don't think that it would be particularly realistic to go to a value of 0 or below in the substitution parameter. We're really only relaxing the restriction in the literature to look at things, values between 0 and 1.
But to go back to the question by Lionel, it probably means that the relevant part of your model is when you move from perfect substitutability, which is the linear case, to just the Cobb-Douglas case, or just before the Cobb-Douglas case. But not the case where you have more complementarity between the two. types of forest.
Okay, I
Because
guess
then it means that you need some secondary forest to obtain ecological services.
Yes, that's my question, Mark.
okay. Well, I mean, I guess the reality is that the secondary forest is already there to some extent. So I guess we're not considering the counterfactual in which the system has 0 secondary forest to begin with.
Lionel, are you okay with this?
We can discuss about that after.
Okay.
I mean, I guess if the starting point is that there's already the 2 types of forest, but I guess theoretically there could be a case where we would have that outcome, but we would have to reverse from where we're currently standing with the system. And that's not feasible in the context of the open loop model that we have. So it's sort of like, it's a theoretical possibility, but I don't know if it's relevant to the results that we're producing here.
Okay. Do participants have other questions?
No, thank you.
No, no one. So anyway, we have reached the time limit because we are 1 hour after the beginning, almost 1 hour after the beginning. So thank you very much, Kelly, for this quite interesting paper. Lionel or Frédéric, maybe you have some announcement to?
No.
No?
We will soon in 2 weeks.